Welcome to RECO12. My name is Justin. I am a son of God and a recovering addict, and I'm blessed to be the host of this meeting and podcast. RECO12 is an organization with the mission of learning and sharing the similarities of addiction of all kinds, and gaining and sharing tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. Speakers from our past meetings have represented many fellowships and identify with addictions with such variety as alcoholism, drugs, food, sex, gambling, theft, codependency, and all the anon groups, just to name a few. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety and who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom webinar each Friday at noon Central Time for about 25 minutes. Then we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of that speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. If you're hearing this meeting in recorded podcast form and would like to participate as a live audience member in the future, please go to www.reco12.com. That's RECO12.com to learn more and to submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations. RECO12 is a self-supporting service, and we appreciate your help in keeping us working our 12th step in this manner. We gratefully accept contributions. If you wish to contribute, you can go to places I'll put in the chat and in the show notes of the live meeting. This is meeting number 146. What a blessing that is, and a miracle, really. We also have a growing and active WhatsApp community. If you'd like to be added there, please send an email with your WhatsApp number to reco12pod@gmail.com. That's RECO12POD@gmail.com. We look forward each week to receiving from the light reflected from our speakers. That light inspires hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. Now let's introduce our guest speaker for today, Tim M., whose topic is being sponsorable and sponsoring others. Now, here's a little bit about Tim. He was born in 1971 and he stopped drinking for the first time in 1990. His last drink was in 1993. Tim spends much of his free time engaged in sponsorship and service. He does what AA asks, and he gets the results it promises in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. 100,000 Al-Anon meetings also help. Other than that, he says he is simply another bozo on the bus. Tim, the floor is yours. Take it away, man. Happy to have you here.
Thanks, Justin. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. I'm also a member of Al-Anon. Been sober since 24th of July 1993. I've been in and out of Al-Anon since 1995. I'm very committed to Al-Anon these days, and my recovery is split 50-50 between the two. And I think my sponsorship is split 50-50 between the two. To talk about being sponsorable, we've got to know what a sponsor is. To know what a sponsor is, we need a little bit of context. I use the big book as my basic text to recover. There's lots of Al-Anon literature which helps, but the big book is like the Christmas tree, and the other AA literature, the Al-Anon literature, the other spiritual resources I use, of which there are many, are like the decorations on the Christmas tree. A Christmas tree without any decorations is still just fine as a Christmas tree, but it does help to have the decorations. But the big book is the basis. Now, the funny thing about the big book is that it really doesn't mention sponsorship, not in the true sense as we understand it today, at least not in the basic text section up to the end of 164, although the question of sponsorship and examples of sponsorship abound through the text itself, including from the pioneers who describe how they were sponsored by some of the earliest members. I think page 263, if my memory serves me correctly, has a presentation of how Dr. Bob took people through the steps, which is very different to what's in the big book. Why do we even talk about sponsorship then? Well, there is a line on sponsorship in the basic text, and it talks about the moment when the recovered alcoholic is presenting and offering the program to a new person. And if the person says, I would like to go ahead, I want to get sober, I want to do it the way you did it, it says something to the effect of, you can offer him much practical advice. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the entire script for how to sponsor people. You can provide much practical direction. That, of course, takes many different forms. I won't give a history of how I've sponsored over the years. What I'm going to talk about is what made me sponsorable as a newcomer. That information is still pertinent today. And I'll tell you how I sponsor today. The way I sponsored changes, as it indeed should. If it didn't, it would mean I wasn't growing. Fortunately, I am growing, and it's not set in aspic or amber. So my form of sponsorship will evolve over time, and I get things wrong and then I adjust. But being sponsorable, as I said, there's a context. What is the context? The context is that I'm a danger to myself as an alcoholic, as an addict. I qualify for a number of other fellowships, but I use AA and Al-Anon, and that for me suffices for everything. I'm a danger to myself with alcohol and drugs because my mind will tell me that a drink is a good idea when it's not. And I trigger something which I can't stop, which could go on for years, which did in fact go on for a year and a half at one point. I started drinking again after a period of sobriety in 1991. It was a year and a half, maybe a little less than that, before I surfaced again. There's a Suzanne Vega line, don't uncork what you can't contain. Don't uncork what you can't contain. So in AA, we say, don't have the first drink. If you don't have the first drink, you can't get drunk. If you get your newcomers to chant that, I think no ill will flow from that. It's a very helpful thing to remember. But to recover, one needs more than willpower and information, although both of those are very necessary. Unfortunately, it requires some grit to stay sober. On the Al-Anon front, it's a similar question. I become preoccupied with the shortcomings of those around me. I try to take control of situations. I try to fix people. I try to get them to rescue me. I blame them for my predicament. I don't look after myself, and there are no flies on me. My Al-Anon problem is manifold, and again, is not solved by a combination of information and willpower. There have been times when I've been so preoccupied with whether the alcoholic is drinking or not, and if they're drinking, what they're doing, if they're going to die, how can we sort them out? How can we get them help? I can't concentrate on anything else. I become very unwell myself. So what's required, unfortunately, is a psychic change, that's the terminology in the big book. Now, people say the big book's very old-fashioned. Well, it's reasonably old-fashioned. I mean, it's not Shakespeare, it's not Bacon, it's not Chaucer. It could be worse, okay? And we still read Shakespeare and Chaucer today with little footnotes to explain anything which is unclear. No, I don't think there's any need to rewrite the thing. One can write other things, and AA indeed has, for good reason. There's no need to leave, to overturn the dead in their crypts and hector them for being as they were then. I'm sure they would find much to find fault with our language and approach and mores and morals and standards today. So that rubs both ways. So we leave them where they are. We just take what they offer. And psychic change is the phrase they use, so we'll use it. It just means a change of mind and a change of heart. A change of mind and a change of heart. And it can't be brought about by snapping your fingers. It's also, sometimes it's talked about as though it's bestowed from on high, when it sort of is, in a sense, or it's a miracle. You just sort of sit in AA waiting for the miracle fairy to tap you on the head with her little magic wand, and then suddenly you're a miracle too. And that's how it's presented. Fortunately, we've cracked the code, and the code is this: the spiritual awakening, the psychic change, the restoration to a condition which we were in at some level before we ever became alcoholics and addicts and psychotic Al-Anons. That's available to anyone if a few simple rules are followed. Something has gone wrong. If we unpick what has gone wrong, we get restored to where we were to start with. it's just like if anyone's had Alexander technique. I was a musician and I had problems, and an Alexander teacher was called in to realign my spine. Basically, the way I was playing the piano was mucked up because I sort of hunched over. And I was taught you get the head in the right position, let the body fall from the head, and everything just starts to become natural then. And I think that's the case here. All we do is we straighten out that which is crooked, and we discover the person we could be is the person we always were underneath the crookedness. And what we have to do, my experience and opinion, nothing wrong with opinions, by the way, as long as the basis for them is valid. There's a movement in AA to ban the opinions. I don't want your opinion, I want your experience, as if the two are different. Of course, an experience related is one's own opinion on what happened. There's no such thing as a purely objective experience. But anyway, the process that I go through is I surrender to a higher power, which means starting with a blank sheet of paper, and then I catalogue in step 4, disclose in step 5, catalogue in step 8, disclose in step 9. It's cataloguing and disclosure. And simply doing that brings about the change which is necessary, provided this is followed by the last 3 steps. Now, sponsorability is a very simple notion. Bill C talks about alcoholics lying in the gutter but having a plan. So you burnt your life to the ground, but you still have an opinion on it. You still have a view, you still have a take, you still have a scheme, a plot, a device. To be sponsorable, I don't know if you've ever had a computer problem, and if you work for a corporation or an agency, they'll often have remote IT technicians, and they ask you to download this little app, and you click on it, and it says, do you want to give so-and-so in Edinburgh or Bangalore permission to manipulate your computer? And you say yes, and now that the little mouse cursor is moving all around the screen without you having to do anything. He's now in charge, or she's now in charge. You ain't in charge. You're now the observer of what's going on. And I think sponsorship is like that. It's giving someone else the authority to establish a framework by which you live, and then you live within that framework. Now, it's not taking over, however, taking over the person's life. It's allowing a framework to be imposed within which the person can safely operate. So the sponsor is not making life decisions for the individual, although there may be strong advice at some point. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with advice as long as it's sound and as long as the scope of it is well understood, the authority, the relative authority of it is understood. That occasionally there are mistakes that are made, but I tell you, in fact, everything I've ever had to make amends for was behavior I came up with myself. I've never had to make amends for behavior for something that a sponsor or similar asked me to do. I've never relapsed because of something a sponsor asked me to do, but I did relapse when I was off on a frolic of my own. So the framework is, again, nothing secretive or nothing cultish. It's very simple, universal principles which predate AA. AA borrowed everything. AA is unique, I think, only in the combination of practices and ideas. Everything you can trace to other things. Even the inventory process can be traced to other organizations, other bodies, other movements. And the system I was given when I was new was to go to lots of meetings, which is simply, a meeting is not something special. It's simply spending time with other alcoholics, and you take your turn talking and listening. That's all. Doesn't require anything. Doesn't require any money. Doesn't require any compliance. Doesn't require any obedience. It's hanging out. which is why this is not a nefarious thing. You're simply being asked to hang out. You're being asked to plan the day in the morning in accordance with the big book, page 86 to 88, to watch out for moral failings during the day and to bring yourself back on track in pages 84 to 85, to consider what you can contribute to life rather than what you can get out of it, taking care, first of all, to put your own oxygen mask on first. Even the airlines agree with the advice we give in Al-Anon and in AA to put your own oxygen mask on first. You see, there's nothing nefarious here. There's nothing that the sponsor gets out of it, which is very important. So it's a very different sort of authority. In any other authority, the person to whom you submit is getting something personally or organizationally out of what you do. Sponsorship is not like that. Sometimes sponsors will say, oh, I've done this work for you. And I stop them and say, no, it's not for me, it's for you. I've just simply suggested it. I'm the dinner lady who puts the potato on the little metal tray. I'm not the food and I'm not the chef. I'm simply part of the delivery system, but it's your food. You get to eat it if you want to. And if you don't want to, that's fine too. But your funeral, but that's fine too. So now the reason I'm at pains to say this is because I think sponsorship is a package deal of a set of instructions on how to live in recovery. So meetings, service, daily program, and the stately but brisk procession through the 12 steps. One, of course, starts steps 10, 11, and 12 straight away because they're a basis for living. And one needs those all the more as a newcomer than one does as one does later on. So I was started on 10, 11, and 12 from day one. On day two, I could help people that were on day one. I could start off by asking the higher power for a sober day and getting direction for the day right from the beginning. Now, sponsorability, therefore, means being willing to submit to this very simple process, which is a voluntary submission. Something Clancy used to say is there is no such thing as dictatorship in sponsorship. As if the sponsee says F you, that's the end of it. There is no comeback. There is no retribution. No one sends the AA police out. If you want to go and be sponsored by someone else, have at it. It's fine. So it's unlike any other relationship where there's authority. Now, the authority is not vertical. The sponsor is not above the sponsee. They are equals, except the sponsor is further ahead and commands respect, not because of their person, of who they are, but on account merely that they are hopefully doing better in life than the sponsee. If the sponsee is doing better in life than the sponsor, you need a new sponsor. Find someone who's doing better than you. This is about monkey see, monkey do. So you pick your monkey carefully. You pick someone who is doing better than you, who's got a better grasp of the program than you, who's got better judgment than you. My job when I was new was to follow what my sponsor suggested. That is very, very simple. Now, I did do what I was told, not always straight away, but I did it. I did always tell the truth, but not always straight away. Maureen used to say, expect sponsees to tell you about 65% of what is going on max. I think that's about right. So it doesn't have to be perfect, although if you err on the side of caution, that won't do you any harm either. But it was simply submission to a system. And the system is tried and tested by millions of people and is also laid out very clearly in the big book. There's nothing secret squirrel here. It's very important when you get a new sponsee to lay out very clearly what is on offer so that there's no accusation of bait and switch later on. So get them to read the big book. So I'm going to ask you to do what's in here, and I'm going to share my experience on how to do it. That's it. I think the two topics of sponsorship and sponsorability are almost impossible to separate. One common phenomenon in sponsorship is argument. People argue with their sponsor. And I understand the desire to argue. But here's the thing. Step one talks about, implies insanity. It doesn't talk about it, it implies it. Why? Because in step two, it's very clear that we're restored to sanity, which implies that we're insane. That might be strong language. The book indeed concedes that this might appear to be strong language. But isn't it true, it goes on to say. I was someone that periodically thought a drink was a good idea, despite the years of counter-evidence and the physical illness and the arrest on my last day of drinking, yet drink a few days later seemed like a good idea again. There are other addictions. On the Al-Anon front, the knowledge that worrying about the alcoholic achieves nothing is insufficient to stop me from worrying. The point of being someone who needs recovery, who needs step two, is you're in a position where you can't see straight, that 90% of what you think may be good and true and right, and maybe only 10% is wrong. But the faculty of determining which is which, the ability to differentiate the true from the false, is impaired itself, which is why I was in trouble in the first place. Everything I thought seemed right to me because I was thinking it. And yet some of it clearly wasn't, and I couldn't consistently tell which. I needed an outside pair of eyes. And so my job was to trust, just trust. So find someone you trust. People say they have trouble trusting, and it's not true. No one has trouble trusting. They trust themselves. Every time you take an action, you're trusting yourself. The question is not one of trust. The question is, who are you trusting and on what basis? Every time I had a drink, I trusted myself. I obeyed my own instructions. Yet I wasn't trustworthy. So the job is to switch the trust towards a more reliable source of direction and instruction. There is the question. So the sponsor, as I say, takes the person through the steps and provides a stable and reliable recovery framework within which, if the person operates within that, they're going to be fine. They're not going to drink or take drugs. Because every moment of the day is somehow accounted for by a constructive, useful activity and the benefit of the individual. But there is the question of advice on other things, advice on other matters. And especially in Al-Anon, I know this is going to be very controversial to those of you who are in Al-Anon, where there's a very strong movement of not giving advice. If I hadn't been given advice in my first few years, I was 21 when I got to recovery. My parents were lovely in many ways, but were not wise. And they certainly weren't people I could go to on most things. They both had a little to offer. But in terms of psychological difficulties, emotional difficulties, the sorts of living difficulties I was encountering, they had nothing useful to offer. In fact, what they offered, especially on one side, I won't say which, was actively damaging. Not intentionally so, but it was. I needed people to explain how to date, how to go to work, how to work when you're at work, as Bob B says, how to be kind to people, how to have a conversation, how to take turns, how to tell a story in such a way that other people understand what you're saying, how to ask for help, how to say no, how to have a hobby, how to relax, how to switch off, 1,000 more things I needed to be shown. Just saying to me, well, there are the steps, I'm off, is neither kind nor helpful. Now, obviously, as one matures in recovery, one learns to think for oneself, one learns to figure things out. And of course, one must swiftly as possible, move to a position of autonomy, where you're essentially relying on God, and your own intuition and your instinct and your experience and your knowledge, and you're checking things out with other people, but the role of other people changes. But at the beginning, if I did not have people who regularly pulled rank, I would be dead 1,000 times over. I remember going on the most catastrophic date when I was a few months sober. I met the person, and I think what's the phrase, where I leapt in where angels feared to tread, and I proceeded very rapidly with this person to engage with them. And the next morning, I phoned Maureen, who was she wasn't my sponsor, so in loco sponsoris, she was acting like a sponsor. And I said, well, I had this date, and this is what happened, and this is what the person said, and this is how I feel awful now. And she said, tear the number up and make sure you don't memorize it before you tear it up. If they ring, put the phone down. And I did that. I obeyed what she said because I trusted her. She was someone who had decades of recovery, had seen hundreds of people like me, and she knew she could spot instinctively what was going on. She was absolutely right. I understand wanting to argue with a sponsor. If you want to argue with your sponsor, get a sponsor you don't want to argue with. It's just easier on everyone. Yeah, it's easier on everyone. What I do in terms of sponsoring people, I do the same with everyone. So it's exactly the same process, whether you're AA or Al-Anon. I've got sponsees in SA and SAA, and even SLA, which is a very different fellowship. But I've had or have sponsees in those, CODA, a couple of other things. Now there are differences in step one, but I always start with the step one in the big book and then cross apply it to the other questions, and it's always possible. But if one understands the principles behind step one from the big book, it makes all of the other addictions, you've got a pattern to fit it to, because the language of step one and all the other fellowships is based on the ideas ultimately contained in the big book. The step one is lifted and adapted. If you don't understand where it came from, it's very difficult to cross apply. It gets very complicated. The big book provides a very simple basis for that. So we do step one in the big book. We understand addiction from the inside, alcoholism from the inside specifically. And then we say, well, how does this apply to Al-Anons? How does this apply to sex? How does this apply to romantic infatuation, sometimes misleadingly called love addiction? It has nothing to do with love. No more than in the big book, it refers to sex as pepper. Pepper is not a food group. The step one is the same, but except for those add-ons, and then all the other steps are the same. It's a single system. I think of it rather like a sausage machine. You put the person in the top, crank the handle, eventually sausages come out. And there's an emergency release valve. If someone gets mangled and presses the escape button, you can pull them out. But it's not advised to stop the process halfway through, in my experience. Taking step three particularly, I let people take as long as they need to get to step three within reason. But after that, you need to proceed briskly, because in taking step three, you're invoking the elements to do their worst. Everything is going to start to come up, and if it is not processed and dealt with, it wreaks havoc. Don't start to look in the darkness unless you're willing to complete the journey. So I get pretty strict with whipping people along and say, if you can't do this, I understand, but call a halt to it and put the lid on it. And when you're genuinely willing and able to put 1 to 2 hours a day into this on a work day, 2 to 4 on a weekend, then come back and we'll resume. But tapping away at the steps, dripping away at it does no good at all, because the ego is rebuilding the whole time. So it's like building a brick wall, one brick at a time. But if you do it too slowly, so the ego is on the other side, removing the bricks as you place them. You've got to be whipping along at quite a speed in order to outstrip the efforts of the ego to deconstruct what you're constructing, which is why this must be swift. And I'll finish on this. There's something that I send sponsees in emergency situations where it's really necessary. And it's a quotation from the CIA website. It's a notice to applicants saying, if anything, something to the effect of this, if anything is going to get in the way, for whatever reason, with your prompt response during this application process, we suggest you go away and come back when you're ready. And frankly, this is the best way to keep cordial relations with sponsees, is to either proceed rapidly or not at all and part friends and remain available for people to come back later if there is any need to. So we're at half past the hour, Justin, so I'll stop there if I may.
Tim, thank you so much. Very good stuff. I've got a page full of notes that I took here. Some great quotes, some great insights that you gave us here. We'll open the floor for a question and answer from our live audience and from myself. Here, a reminder to our live audience: if you have a question for Tim, please type it in the Q&A link there at the bottom of your window. We've got a couple of those that have come in. We'll get to those here in a minute. I want to start off with a question that came from something that you mentioned, and it seemed like it just went past by quickly, but man, it hit me hard. You said that you start on step 10 through 12, starting from day one with new sponsees. What does that look like to start them right there at 10 through 12 when you start off with a new sponsee?
Very simple. You take pages 84 to 88 of the big book, and you read them often enough that the instruction elements, there's instruction and commentary, that the instruction elements are so baked into the person's mind that they become a method for living. There is nothing in there which is unique to AA. It's similar to all spiritual traditions and religious traditions around the world. So there's a lot of common sense behind it. If one weren't in recovery, it would make very good sense to plan the day, to correct your behavior as you go along. I mean, there's nothing to look at being constructive rather than selfish. There's nothing magical in there. It's basic common sense. So first thing in the morning, God, please direct my thinking, divorce my thinking from self-seeking, self-pity, and dishonest motives. You consider your plans for the day. When in doubt, you say, God, give me the right thought or action. Free me from self-will. As you go through the day, step 10, continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. And basically come back to the moment, come back to the task at hand. If your mind leaves the room, go and call someone and say, I can't think this through. I've lost it completely. Help me. So it's a very good framework, and it's better. Those 4 pages are better than any individual can come up with. This is why I said the sponsor is the dinner lady putting the food on the metal tray. You're not cooking the food yourself. You're simply channeling pre-existing food to the sponsee.
Yeah, I love that. So basically you start them off there on those pages 86 or 88. Do you say, hey, read these every morning and every night? Or do you just say, hey, every time we get together, we're going to read these and go through that?
No, I treat people like grown-ups and say, some people come in very, very damaged. They might have mental health issues. They might have some people are dyslexic. There are times you really need to walk people through those. But I have lots of written notes which help people to pick apart, to understand what to do with each line, commentaries. So there's I give people lots and lots of materials, but I want to treat people like adults. Here are the materials, use them. And if you have a question, don't hesitate to contact me. But I don't like to spoon feed. I don't think it does people any good, because people must be responsible for their own recoveries. I don't take people through the steps. They take themselves through the steps, but I am the guide to that process. But they've got to hike themselves up the mountain. I'm not carrying them. They're hiking with me.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Tim. All right. We've got several questions that have come in. I'm going to combine a couple of them, one from David and one from Jill. They both are kind of the same question. Do you have more than one sponsor, or do you have a sponsor for each fellowship, do you recommend that people have a sponsor for each fellowship, or just one sponsor who encompasses them all?
It's a very, very good question. And now I'm not going to give an answer which is necessarily going to be true for everyone, but I'll tell you what I currently do. This works very, very well. I only have one sponsor. I don't sponsor people that have other sponsors, because you can't ride two horses at once. You can't operate two systems at once. You can't have two sets of steps at the same time. It makes absolutely no sense, because each set of steps is holistic. It covers the whole of your life. It can't possibly be in two sets of steps at once. It's nonsensical. Now, the one problem here is when someone has multiple addictions going on. Certainly with food and with sex. I'm less familiar with gambling. I've had very few gambling sponsees, but certainly with sponsees with food and sex as problems. I can deal with the sponsees where sex or romance addiction are problematic. But although I've had food problems, I'm not an OA person or any of the other food fellowships. I haven't needed that. I've dealt with my food and body dysmorphia stuff as simply as character defects. But a lot of people need to be really smashed like walnuts when it comes to those. And so what I do is I get them to attend the meetings of the fellowship in question, to usually go to one of my pals and one of my sponsees who can take them through the first three steps. And then the first three steps in AA, the first three steps in OA, they're like two tributaries of a river, which then merge at the point of step 3, and then it's a single river which continues from that point, with ongoing accountability as well. I encourage people to have a little group of friends in, let's say it's OA, to whom they can be accountable and chat through specific questions to do with food. And of course, just because I'm sponsoring someone doesn't mean that they can't go and talk to whoever they want. And I, in fact, encourage people to talk to lots of people, get input from left, right, and centre. But there has to be in any kind of chain of command, you can't have double-headed management. And this is in the concepts as well. You have double-headed management, you're in for trouble. And what I find almost invariably, when you've got multiple sponsors, the sponsors are played off against each other unconsciously. So you go to sponsor A for the material you should be going to sponsor B on, and vice versa, as you instinctively go to the person that's going to give you the easiest time. And when I've tried to split authority between more than one sponsor, even where the second person is not a sponsor in name even, but someone who I said, well, on this matter, I'm going to seek their advice, I've got into the most frightful trouble, because unconsciously I seek out someone that will see things from my point of view. I'm in a fortunate position in that I qualify for so many fellowships. I can usually cover lots of things under one roof. But I'll tell you one thing which does help, is that a lot of people approach me who've got food problems as well as alcohol, or a lot of the Al-Anons. So they're not alcoholics. So I sponsor them as an Al-Anon, but they also have a food thing. I've got an an OA sponsee that runs a cyclical thing on the first 3 steps, which they can join at any point to get a really thorough grounding in the first 3 steps and get food plans in place if they want to do that, and so on. And that seems to solve the problem very, very well. And this works extremely well. I don't have any problems at all doing this. And there's a lot less relapse and argy-bargy and secrecy that happens when you've got splitting between different sponsors. I'm going to be very controversial here. If someone is in a very intensive psychotherapeutic program, again, it's almost impossible in my experience to sponsor them, because the philosophy is often entirely different. The process of the steps to me is about being rid of self and stopping looking at oneself, only looking at oneself from a moral point of view. And they go to therapy, encouraged to look at the past in a very different way. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it's different. And you spend the whole time with the poor soul trying to reconcile 2 irreconcilable systems. So what I've said to people is, if you need to do therapy, and that's the more urgent thing, Go and do that, and then come back when you're done, and then we can do the steps. And that's worked very well. So go and find out what you need to find out, bring back the information, then we'll work the steps on the information. And that, again, saves the two being played off against each other. The therapists often hate it as well when people are working the steps and come back, well, my sponsor said this, my sponsor said that. So next question, Justin.
Oh, love it. Thank you for that clarification, for the digging into that. That really helps, Tim. All right, another question from an anonymous attendee. This person asks or says, I work a strong program, but it seems my sponsor is sicker than me. We have become sort of co-sponsors more than sponsor-sponsee. Is it necessary to get a new sponsor?
Very good question. My approach with sponsorship, with how to look for a sponsor, how to choose one, when to switch, is this. What does it say in the big book? If you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. So the sponsor is not a therapist or a friend or anything like that. They are a guide to the 12 steps. They're a guide to the traditions and the concepts. Necessarily, for them to be a good guide, if you're hiking up a mountain, they would need to know the mountain better than you. And a very good rule of thumb is this: to have a sponsor who is more active in recovery, that is helping more people, that is more active in service than you are. Ideally, if your major problem is in relationships and marriage, if your sponsor is married and has a happy marriage, that might be a very helpful person to have as a sponsor. Similarly with work, if your major problem is work, is having an unemployed sponsor the best? Maybe not, but God works miracles in extraordinary ways. So I look for someone who is ahead of me spiritually and who has more experience and is more active than me. And I've had the same sponsor for 12 years and the criteria continue to be met. And unfortunately, one has to be absolutely ruthless about this. So no sentimentality. If I needed someone different, I would go for someone different. So my previous sponsor is wonderful, but he wasn't doing in AA what I was doing and what I needed guidance on at the time. I had a lot of sponsors. I was doing a huge amount of service, and my sponsor at the time did not have the relevant experience. So one has to be brutal and just go for the best that you can find.
Wow, love that. Thank you. All right, question from Jason. Jason asks, and this is a really cool introspective type question for you, Tim. What are you currently struggling with as a sponsee?
Well, I suppose that can mean one of two things. More narrowly, in my capacity as a sponsee, in my relationship with my sponsor, I'm not struggling with anything at all. I have a very good relationship with my sponsor. I'm not saying that just because I'm in his house right now. It's genuinely true. But I have to say, so I've been sober for 29 years and some change. And I go through the steps once a quarter to clean out the cupboard. And I'm just trying to think, do I perceive myself to have any problems in my life? And I don't. Sorry about that, but I just don't. Do I have a full range of human emotions? Yes. Do I have character defects which flare up? Absolutely. But if you said to me, how happy are you on a scale of 0 to 10, I'd be up around a 9 most of the time. How often do you have a bad day? I don't even know how to define the term in my current life. There are days that I'm very tired physically. I think that's the worst that things get. But the program works. If you work it very, very diligently for a long time, and I'm someone that not just with lots of addictions, but was very mentally ill when I got to AA. And I haven't had depression or real anxiety for a very long time. It's done extraordinary things, but it's incremental lifestyle changes, basically. Very slow, very slow.
Love that. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, but these promises will happen. And I love your testimony of the promises coming true in your life. Thank you for sharing that, Tim. Another question from the live audience. This is from Alan. Alan asks, how do you not take on your sponsee's baggage? Often the sponsees, well, all of us come in with a lot of baggage, but how do you not take that on?
Okay, so let's do the Al-Anon. Let's do the Al-Anon side of this. I know some of you, looking at the names, I recognize a couple of people who've been to a few Al-Anon meetings. And as I said, as you said, actually in the intro, 100,000 Al-Anon meetings don't hurt. I remember my go. So I don't have an Al-Anon sponsor, but I have an Al-Anon go-to person who I talk through some Al-Anon stuff. They're called Tom, who's been in recovery since 1976 and Al-Anon since 1978. And I once wrote a very long message, a reasonably long message about some complex problem in my life. And I wanted a detailed response from him. And he wrote back, 100,000 Al-Anon meetings. That was his prescription. And I had another go. I tried to reframe the question in such a way as to elicit a more detailed response. And he wrote back 200,000 Al-Anon meetings. And I knew that if I continued that the prescription, it's like, you know, with the police where the fine just doubles every time you argue with the fine. He's not wrong. But there are some quick wins here. The quick wins, first of all, your sponsee's addiction or alcoholism, I didn't cause it. I can't control it. I can't cure it. They were alcoholic or Al-Anonic before I walked in the room. So the fact they're now manifesting alcoholism or Al-Anonism in their relationship with me is not a reflection of me. I might have occasioned it, but I didn't cause it. And there's a fundamental difference. Very interesting and simple principle. I am 100% responsible for my beliefs, thinking, behavior, feelings, internal world and external world. And you are 100% responsible for your beliefs, thinking, behavior, internal world, external world, and feelings. I'm over here, you're over there. I'm responsible for me, you're responsible for you. Now, there are, and I've done sequences, a series of talks on the complications of sponsorship. There's a very good story in the big book. I think it's our Southern friend, who also I think is Fitz Mayo, one of the early AAs, where there's a perfect example of how sponsorship can work, in that he presents his problems to someone. The person asks him, are you willing to do this? Are you willing to do that? And Fitz says yes to each of those things. And the person says, well, all of your problems are solved. And then he leaves the room. So my job is to offer the program to people. I don't argue and negotiate because it's a waste of time. In the same way that you don't, when you go to Walmart, you don't negotiate the price. You're not in the souk. You're not in Morocco here. You just, the Walmart price is the Walmart price. You don't haggle at the till. And it's a little bit like that with sponsorship. We're not paid enough as sponsors. In other words, we're not paid at all to haggle. So you offer, and either they want it or they don't. And if someone is argumentative, if I'm in my right mind, I'll remember to say, you don't seem today to be enthusiastically excited about accepting what I have to offer. I understand that. I'd struggle to accept what I have to offer in your position. But why don't you think it over? Give me a call when you are ready. I'm not going to argue. And I've had that conversation a lot of times, and people respect that. People understand it as well, because you're recognizing the position that they're in. What I won't tolerate, practically speaking, of course, one tolerates things spiritually, one recognizes that people are where they are. So one should never become angry with sponsees. If one does become angry, something has gone wrong. Something has gone wrong. But even very subtle forms of resistance and manipulation, I bring them out into the open. I remember a conversation with someone once many years ago where when I suggested something, there'd be these deathly silences or sighing, very loud sighing over the phone. And I simply said, you just sighed very loudly. Were you trying to communicate something to me with that sigh? What were you trying to communicate? Let's talk about what you mean by that. So you bring those things out into the open. Part of anonism is looking to be rescued by someone. Or for many anons, there are lots of different ways of being an anon. But part of it is looking for rescue. And part of it, you see, I would get into relationships with people who are very unwell, but who had a sort of trembling excitement to their energy, if that makes any sense. And it was as though I had no energy source myself. I had no power source myself. So I needed to vampirically clamp myself onto someone with a power source and feed off their life energy. And that's often the relationship between the Al-Anon and the alcoholic. The Al-Anon is kind of dead inside, but the alcoholic has life because they have alcohol. So the Al-Anonic actually needs the alcoholic either to be basically to be drunk, to have access to that power. It's very unwell. In recovery, that flips, and the Al-Anon will want, or the Al-Anon type, sometimes it's AAs who have an Al-Anon stripe down their back, as they say. They want the energy or the vivacity or the cheer or the whatever it is of the sponsor to compensate for their own deadness. And that's where the sponsee wants to form a special relationship with the sponsor. A Course in Miracles is a very good place to learn more about that. There are two very good Course in Miracles teachers, Earl Purdy, P-U-R-D-Y, and Anna Kujawa, K-U-J-A-W-A, who I found incredibly helpful. Their stuff is free of charge. I stress that very importantly. Lots of Course in Miracles stuff is free of charge, so that there's no, I'm not getting a commission here on anything. And they're very good on the subject of special relationships. And this often happens in sponsees where the sponsee wants special attention, wants pretexts to have conversations because they don't want the program, they somehow want you. This isn't flattering to the person at all. It's a very unhealthy thing. And unfortunately, one has to just, business is business. And although we're not paid, we're not professionals, it has a sponsorship relationship, I think, to be very successful in the long term, to be maximally successful, has to have the same professional distance as between a doctor and a patient, that it can be very cordial and very loving and very kind. But I remember I had a conversation with Brian, who's my sponsor, many years ago. Well, I said, could we have a coffee, just one day, just to chat? And he said, you know we're not friends, don't you? You know we're not friends. And that hurt me because I was after a special relationship with him. I wanted a relationship where, let me just put something in the chat. Anna Jawa, Purdy, special relationships. You see, I have my friends, but I felt he was several grades above, and that by virtue of him being my sponsor, I would be able to, as it were, co-opt him as part of my friendship circle. But I couldn't pay the dues for that level. But I thought because I was a sponsor, I was entitled to the friendship as well. and I wasn't. A friendship must be freely offered. And so just because someone is your sponsor doesn't mean you've got them over a barrel and that you can demand anything of them. And people can be incredibly demanding of sponsors in a very unreasonable way, which is why right from the beginning, I very rarely have a problem with this now. It used to be a big problem. And the way I've got round it is I introduce my sponsees to each other. And we have meetings where me and my sponsor actually get all of our sponsees, or as many as want to come, on Zoom meetings, and people get to know each other. So you're a member of a crew, a gang of people. So the reliance is on the gang. It's not on the individual person. And the last thing I'd say, if you've got a problem with the sponsor, do not try and resolve it with the sponsor. Go and talk to a close-mouthed friend and fix it, sort it out if you can't sort it out. Now, there are things where there are practical things which need to be sorted out with the sponsor directly. I mean, a psychological thing where there's a real rift there. The sponsor is not so you never read inventory to the sponsor about the sponsor. It's so inappropriate, that sort of thing. And if one maintains these boundaries, then I have almost no problems today on that front of entanglement. Touch wood. So I keep going to my Al-Anon meetings. So do we have any more questions?
There was one more question that just barely came in. See, how from an anonymous attendee, how come you're at your sponsor's house if you don't think special relationships are not good? There you go.
Yeah, that's an impudent question. I'm here with lots of other people because we're putting on a conference this weekend. That's why I'm here.
Perfect.
It's not a special. Also, there's a fundamental difference between someone who is unrecovered, trying to form a close relationship with the sponsor, so my sponsor is ahead of me. He's sober 6 weeks longer than me. We're not friends. He's still my sponsor. And I've got incredibly strong boundaries. He's got incredibly strong boundaries. There's no risk of, you see, this is the curious thing about sponsorship. A special relationship is not about the degree of closeness. It's about the type of closeness. So I have the same courteous professional distance with my sponsor when I'm here staying in his house as I do when I'm several thousand miles away in London. There is absolutely no entanglement there. So special relationships are about entanglement, not about how much time you spend or how cordial the relations are. It's about the formality of the relationship. And I don't think if I was 20 or 15 or 10 years sober, I don't know if I'd be here. I'm not sure if I've been invited. So it's not a straightforward question. Sponsorship is a relationship unlike any other.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we'll close this meeting down here. Thank you all. Thanks, Tim. It was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. Come back next week. Next week, we've got another awesome guest, Nikki M., who will knock our socks off with the topic of the exact instructions of the Big Book. As always, I'm looking forward to that conversation. All right, let's launch off into the rest of our day with the Serenity Prayer that Tim will say for us.
Thank you. Would you please help me close with the Serenity Prayer? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Thank you, Tim. Everybody keep coming back. Come trudge this happy road with us. It's worth it, and you are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight. Still searching for glimmers of light. Feet still on the ground, I can still be found. Standing still.
My wings are torn and tattered, but I know I still can fly. I may not soar unfettered, I may not rise too high.
Recorded in the book of life and binded with the seal that I am bowed and broken, I am standing